Whether to right or to left, forward or backward, you must go on, without asking what lies before or behind you.
1914. Austria was at war. Arnold Schoenberg was called up in 1915. He was stationed at a barracks near the imperial palace of Schönbrunn. One day he was sent with a message into the center of Vienna. His companion on the short tram ride was to be Paul Vengraf, another enlisted man. But which tram to take?
We left the barracks and came into the street, and there I said, I think I take the 36, I said, down to the ring and from there up to the hospital. I take the 71, he answered, very dryly. I said, yes, but the 71 leads us away from our destination. Took out something of his pocket, a kind of used envelope or something like that, and began to draw a circle, and through the circle he made a tangente. And said, now that is where we are, and that is where we have to go. You see, it's the shortest way. Well, I said, I'm not sure, but I've just shown it to you. I think I better take this 36. He lifted his head, gave me a glance full of contempt for an idiot who didn't accept a scientific argument, and walked away from me to the 71. And that was the last I've seen of him.
Schoenberg was discharged from the army in 1917. When the war ended, Central Europe was in chaos. Vienna had its full ration of riot, misery, and famine. Schoenberg's radicalism never extended to politics, and the chronic instability of life in the post-war world depressed him.
But perhaps, for we Viennese seem to be a patient lot, perhaps the worst was, after all, the overturning of everything one has believed in. That was probably the most grievous thing of all.
He found himself in what I think can be described as a new artistic environment. If we've characterized the dominant forces of the pre-war years as concerned with expressionism, with a search inwards rather than the search outwards in the world, a replacement of what had come to be regarded as sterile outward forms with a more penetrating, a more true concern with the reality of the human person and the soul. After the war, the opposite may be said to be true. Now we come into an atmosphere of what has been called new objectivity, and the dominant compositional trends, in fact the dominant artistic trends, can be summoned up by a word of Brecht: truth is concrete. The attempt now, whether in Germany and Austria or in France or in other countries, was to lighten the heavy subjective load of music, to not concern oneself with this massive paraphernalia dredged up by psychoanalysis, and rather to concentrate on the clear-cut expression of a gesture and the clear-cut expression of a style. You find this in the thinking of the French composers associated under the group Les Six, among them Milhaud and Honegger and Poulenc. And you find this in Germany with the emergence of composers like Paul Hindemith and Kurt Weill. For Schoenberg, this put him in a rather complicated position. Before the war, it was a clear-cut thing. He and his school, now consisting of Alban Berg, Anton Webern, Hans Eisler and others, had been a clear-cut avant-garde, but clearly derived from the predominant tendencies of Germano-Austrian music. Now he finds himself in a peculiar middle position. He is still very new and very problematic and remains so, but he is at odds with the younger men as he is at odds with the older and more conservative men.
The young composers find my way a blind alley. Who, given a chance in life's carnival, would not prefer a carousel to a blind alley? I never dissuaded anyone from tonality. Rather, I warned them against the blind alley, which is not for those who want to go round in circles. Nowadays it is après-moi le cul-de-sac. I blundered into it, and shall patiently wait there till my last breath, the breath that still supplies the wind for their miserable carousels.
Was Schoenberg affected by the new spirit? We must answer, yes, he was to some extent affected by it, even despite himself. Because in the works after Opus 23, we do find the emergence of something which no one could have imagined in the pre-war works. We find Baroque forms, we find minuets and sarabands, marches, and we find a tendency to write serenades and suites, things recalling 18th century music rather than the late 19th century from which Schoenberg had come. And in the spirit of the music, for instance, in this march from the serenade, you can hear something which, if still very much the characteristic voice of Arnold Schoenberg, can be seen somehow to be affected by the newer sound and the new objectivity of the post-war years.
Almost 50, with nothing but years of warfare behind me, and am unfortunately still given to getting very worked up about a great many things, although there is nothing I need more than peace. I desire no accusations, no attacks, no defence, no publicity, no triumph.
Schoenberg's wife, Matilda, died in 1923. A year later, he married Gertrude, the sister of one of his pupils, Rudolf Kolisch, a future leader of the Pro-Arte Quartet. Despite this happy marriage to a much younger woman, nothing could really bridge the gap that Schoenberg felt opening between himself and the new generation.
The young think they must at all costs have it in for what has gone before them. I know I certainly did not do so. I did not have it in for Brahms nor for Wagner. At most for the Brahmins and Wagnerites, but that is different, for they are scarcely good. With the men themselves, I always felt myself, though not wishing to presume, to have something in common. But those who think they must wipe the slate clean of their predecessors, they are surely politicians and tradesmen, not artists.
If you talk about any other composer in the history of music, you don't necessarily have to talk about a technique, you just talk about his pieces. But Schoenberg was the inventor of an entirely new technique of composition, the so-called technique of composition with 12 notes related only one to another.
I am still more a composer than a theorist. When I compose, I try to forget all theories, but as regards so-called composition with 12 tones, this is a method more of a craftsmanly nature, which exerts no decisive influence on either the work's structure or its character. The question is simply, how the material is treated.
I think the first popular misconception is that Schoenberg invented a new technique, sort of arbitrarily, and then composed music with it. Whereas the truth is the exact opposite. What Schoenberg actually did was develop a style of composing, a certain kind of music, and then found that he did not have the means to organize it. And he found this all-embracing 12-tone technique, in his opinion, to clarify the procedure of composing the music and hopefully of listening to it.
Composition with 12 tones has no other aim than comprehensibility.
Another misconception, it's popularly believed that you have to hear all the technical operations of a musical technique in order to appreciate the music. I don't think this is so, and I don't think it would even be possible, because even if all the people who listened to Schoenberg's music had some inklings of how the 12-tone technique worked, they would only be able to hear the bare outlines and would never be able to hear the details of the technique. After all, if you drive across a bridge, you don't have to know how the engineering works to get from one side to another. The actual 12-tone technique is not entirely a new technique. Eliot says somewhere that what is wholly new is wholly bad, and similarly with this technique, it's a mixture of old things and new things. The old things are partly contrapuntal devices like canon and canon by inversion and canon backwards, which are known to scholastic composers of the 16th century. It's partly an extension of the customary preoccupation of composers of all ages to integrate their works thematically, that is, to invent a tune and derive other tunes from it. And much time has been spent invaluably showing how contrast in music, in the classical composers, in Mozart and Beethoven, very often contains a high degree of thematic integration, where similar motifs are used and transformed rhythmically and in character to represent something quite different. All these elements go into the 12-tone technique, as well as the idea of non-repetition, which is standard practice in almost any educational system. Writers, painters, musicians are all taught to practice their art without perpetually repeating things ad infinitum, for one very simple objective reason, that it's boring to perpetually repeat the same thing. These are three elements that go towards the making of this particular system. The fourth element, and the one I would describe as an entirely new element, has to do with the harmony. And this is the one that has caused the most problems in the comprehending of the music of Schoenberg. If Bartók or Stravinsky or another composer had invented the 12-tone technique, it would have been probably a purely melodic technique with perhaps a relic of simple traditional harmony. But the music that Schoenberg and Strauss and others were writing at the beginning of the 20th century was already very complex harmonically, as we've seen. There were chords of all kinds, which were not customary in the 18th and 19th century, frequently used in the music. So Schoenberg had the idea of deriving all elements in a piece, from the most basic harmonies to the most tiny virtuoso decorative passages, from the same arrangement of the notes into some kind of a melodic formula. Now you can hear that in the very first piece that Schoenberg wrote in the so-called 12-tone technique, which is a waltz for piano. It's rather nice that it should be a waltz for piano, because a waltz is a traditional Viennese form, and the connection between the old form and the new content perhaps clarifies something of the atmosphere of the early days of the 12-tone technique. Remembering the beginning of that waltz, what you in fact heard was a tune played by the right hand of the piano, accompanied by some broken-up harmonic fragments. Now that tune, which went something like this, etc., and was accompanied by some harmonies, in fact is all the 12 notes without any internal repetition. If I take the rhythmic arrangement out of it, it sounds something like this, and this is what 12-tone rows sound like in their, if we can call it, pure form. Now that's just an ordering of 12 different notes, and the technique makes it possible to arrange these in many different ways. And the piece in fact consists of many different arrangements of these notes, always with the order maintained, but the notes put in different positions, right at the top of the piano and right at the bottom, and in groups of 3s and 4s and 5s and 2s. Now the problematic aspect, of course, is the harmony. And the new thing in the 12-tone technique, and the one thing which is totally new and unpredictable, is the way the harmony is made. Now, if I take this ordering of notes, I can, as it were, congeal this into a set of chords. Here are those 12 notes divided into 3, made into 3 4-note chords. Now, those chords aren't tonal chords. They consist of all sorts of varied intervals, and they don't come in the repertoire of traditional music. But each one is evocative, and each one is regulated and given a certain character, red, blue, and green, if you like, and they add up to the 12-tone row. Now, this is one of the new ways of developing the music. I can show you this by a simple example, where the right hand plays a tune of 4 notes, while the other 8 are used for the accompaniment. Four notes. Accompaniment. In fact, broken versions of the chords which I played you just now. This new technique, which was, as it were, a congealing or a clarification of all the tendencies in Schoenberg's music up to this time, released the floodgates for him. Once this technique had been formulated, it seemed to produce endless possibilities, and it led, if you like, to a kind of second Schoenberg period, or even third Schoenberg period, which was a classical one, with very large pieces, with enormous numbers of notes and technical devices. These are regarded as the most difficult pieces of his work, because there is a strange contrast between the choice of classical forms, as we've shown were characteristic of this period, and this new technique. And it finds its fruition really in the variations for orchestra. Here you have a theme, which is a sort of large recitative, and a set of variations and a finale. All the resources of the modern orchestra are brought to play. It's one of the hardest pieces to play in the repertoire. It's extremely rich, extremely concise, and it's very short for such an enormous amount of activity.
meet Schoenberg was quite an ordeal, you know. He was rather terrifying.
Roberto Gerard, composer and Schoenberg pupil in the 1920s.
I remember the face, and that ascetic face, those burning eyes, serious, tense, unsmiling. A man with a sense of mission was tremendous.
I am much more in the habit of refusing requests, even when made in fitting terms. I often give orders, but never take them, and I make a special point of never doing business. Not merely because I dread everything connected with it, but because nothing brings people so close together as business. My own taste, however, is for keeping my distance.
He had to adopt a defensive attitude. When I say defensive, I mean, of course, aggressive. He knew very well that the only way of defending oneself is to attack.
In 1926, he moved once more to Berlin to teach composition at the Prussian Academy. Germany was beset by violent political upheaval, and its tone was ominous for Schoenberg. For all that, he remained scornful of political activity by an artist. As the climate worsened, he moved ever closer towards art as religious philosophy, where the artist came down from the mountain like Moses with a message for mankind.
I believe art is born of I must, not of I can. Whatever a craftsman wants to do, he can do, but the artist must. Normal men possess a conviction. The great man is possessed by a faith. From the lives of truly great men, it can be deduced that the urge for creation responds to an instinctive feeling of living only in order to deliver a message to mankind. Such a man is no longer an artist, but has become something greater, a prophet. Every great man has provided a model which should have taught his age that things needed changing, and why and how. But the age takes no notice.
Schoenberg's tendency to negate all that was before him is the old, tested Jewish tactics, which are always put into practice at an opportune moment, to destroy the cultural values of the host peoples in order to set up their own as the only valid ones.
Nowadays, people aim to wipe out my artistic views with stink bombs of pseudo-scientific and pseudo-philosophic origin. When someone lacks the capacity for simple reception and the ability to see for himself, he reaches for a philosophy of life. Once one has seen how a party badge transforms an underdog automatically and promptly into a superman ready to abdicate his personal powers of decision, one will take these philosophies of life no more seriously than one does other fashionable slogans. So if times were normal, we should have to go into things, other troublesome things, and should presumably do it in the way in which, in the end, we always found the only suitable one, by turning our backs on whomsoever deserves it.
But he could not turn his back forever. Brought up officially as a Christian, he was drawn inexorably back to the Jewish faith of his ancestors.
For 14 years, I have been prepared for what has now happened. During this long time, I have been able to prepare myself for it thoroughly, and have finally cut myself off